Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that wonderful, warm welcome. It's great news that we are a few months away from one of the biggest and most historic decisions this country will take about its future. I think it is absolutely fantastic news that we forced the political class in Britain to give us a referendum that they were against. And remember, without us, it would never, ever have happened. Now, of course, the referendum is going to be based on Mr. Cameron's renegotiated deal. I don't know whether you saw the letter that he sent to the head of the European Council. He's really not asking for anything. He's asking for a commitment that Britain won't have to join the euro. I would suggest to you there is more possibility and probability of Britain doing a joint moon landing with the European Union than us joining the euro. So he's asking for a series of promises, perhaps to be written into a treaty in a few years' time. And the only concrete thing that he's asked for is he wants a change to migrant benefits. And guess what they've told him? They've told him where to go. They've said no. And so he's decided that to get that through, he will change benefits for British people as well. He is asking for nothing. He will get nothing. This renegotiation, is not worth a row of beans. He's going to try and pull the wool over the eyes of the British electorate, and our job is to make sure he doesn't get away with it. But what he's not asking for, he's not asking for the fundamental things that really matter to people. He's not asking for us to regain the supremacy of law, for us perhaps at least to have a parliamentary veto over a piece of legislation that damages British interests. He's not asking for that. He's not asking in any way at all for a reduction to our massive daily, weekly, monthly and annual financial contribution. Not asking for a penny. And it was funny because one of his greatest claims to victory was that he managed a few years ago to get the European Union for the first time to reduce its budget. And yet, as part of that deal, which he claimed as a victory, the British contribution went up. If that's what victory looks like, I'd hate to see what a defeat looks like. And about 18 months after that, if you remember, just before the election, there was a bill, an extra 1.75 billion sterling bill was presented. And Mr. Cameron went on the television and spoke at the dispatch box and said, "We will not pay this money." And it all sounded absolutely marvellous. But guess what? We've paid the bill. We've paid the bill. And he will not, in this renegotiation, even touch upon what is now, without doubt, the biggest, single, most important issue in British politics, namely the fact that we have an open door to the whole of the European Union. He's not even going to attempt to talk about any of those things. And what he will also not do at any point in time, and frankly what we have to do, is to really talk about what this referendum is about. It is a simple choice about whether we wish to remain an independent, self-governing nation-state or be an outlier of what is growing into a centralised, undemocratic, badly run, failing monstrosity. It's actually quite simple. And it isn't really very hard, is it, to get to the core of this issue. That is what laughingly is called a British passport. You've all got one, but do you know what the first two words on it are? It says European Union, and that passport is now held by nearly 500 million people, all of whom have the freedom to come to Britain, to work in Britain, to use the social security system in Britain. And frankly, that's not good enough. This referendum, in the end, is about allegiance. It's about who we are. Let me ask you a question. Would you pay allegiance to this flag? No, you got it wrong. Right, well, the technical boys have made a balls of it, so I'll carry on without them. You can't get the staff, no. The point I was trying to make is, do we want the Star-Spangled Banner or do we want the Union Jack? And it's pretty clear which of those we want, I think. I don't want the Star-Spangled Banner. I don't want to have 75% of my laws now made by a set of institutions based in Brussels over which we have virtually no rights of veto. I don't think it's a very good deal for the British taxpayer to pour in £55 million a day to an organisation whose accounts have not been signed off by the auditors for the last 20 years in a row. And I think that every warning that we gave back in 2004, when the European Union admitted former communist countries, poor countries, with complete free movement of people, every warning we gave about what that would mean in terms of migratory flows was met with condemnation and abuse from the political class and much of the media. But, ladies and gentlemen, we've actually been proved right on this. If you say to people in poor countries they can come to relatively rich countries, you haven't got to be a rocket scientist to work out what they're going to do. And the impact in this country, the impact over the last decade and more, has been that we've seen the wages of ordinary British workers compressed. We've seen a housing crisis. We've seen a housing crisis that means that we now have to build one new house every 7 minutes just to cope with current levels of immigration. We have a health crisis. We have a crisis of primary school places. And frankly, it is irresponsible government to have an open door, because how on earth can you plan what primary school provision you need? How on earth can you plan what healthcare provision you need if you haven't got a clue in the next 3 or 4 years how many people are coming into Britain? Now, we've been right about many of these things. But in this referendum, we will find ourselves up against virtually the entire political class. We'll find ourselves up against the Labour Party, which in a way is disappointing. I wouldn't describe myself as being a natural supporter of Jeremy Corbyn. Although I do rather like the proposal from the monster raving loony party in the Oldham West and Royton by-election, and they think we should keep the Falkland Islands but give Mr Corbyn to Argentina. It's not a bad idea. But the one thing that I might have agreed with Jeremy Corbyn on is that he, as a Bennite, had been opposed to the European project for 40 years, but I'm afraid as Labour leader, he's given up on that. So the Labour Party supports it. Most of the Conservative Party will support it. We'll hear lots of brave words during the referendum, and let's hope I'm wrong, but I think in the end, most people in that party in Westminster will probably choose to put their career and their party, sadly, before their country. I hope I'm wrong, but I guess we'll see that. The Liberal Democrats... Who? You see, I always get this now. Who? But the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish National Party, who must be the most illogical nationalist party who've ever existed in the history of global politics, appear to be quite happy for Scotland to be part of the European Union, which also, of course, would mean ultimately members of the euro. So they're all lined up. We know that many of the big multinational corporations are very much in support of the European Union. It gives them a method of actually making the rules in their own industries, which excludes many of their small and medium-sized competitors. And of course, they've got together with this group, BSE. I'm not so sure that was the wisest. I don't know who they paid for their brand consulting, but they perhaps ought to ask their money back, really, oughtn't they? But BSE, headed up by Lord Rose, who I thought looked very much like he didn't want to be there at their launch, but behind him are the Euro fanatics. Behind him is, of course, Richard Branson. Behind him, well, if you boo for Richard Branson, you wait for the next one. All right? And Lord Mandelson. And I can do even better than that, Tony Blair. Thank you. And this is the same crew. This is the same crew who 15 years ago told us that if we didn't join the euro, do you remember? We didn't join the euro, foreign and direct investment into Britain would cease, the City of London would close down, no car manufacturers would be in the country, that we'd be ruined if we didn't join the euro. Well, I put it to you that that self-same crew were wrong then and they're wrong now. And the arguments they make are utterly and entirely negative. They're arguments that say that Britain simply isn't big enough to stand on her own 2 feet and govern herself. I've seen this face to face. I saw it last year in 2014 when Nick Clegg challenged me to those live head-to-head debates. I was very grateful to Nick for giving us that wonderful opportunity. And by the way, there's a rematch on Monday. Yeah, Monday night. Next Monday night at the Oxford Union, it'll be Bill Cash and myself against Nick Clegg and Manuel Barroso. And I'm looking forward to it enormously. Anyway, we were doing those debates last year, and it was during the first debate, and we were talking about trade. And Nick said to the audience, he said, look, Britain simply isn't big enough. We need to be part of a bigger European club to have clout on the global stage. On our own, we simply can't do it. And I responded to that by saying that Iceland, with a population of less than 1/3 had just managed to conduct their own trade deal with China. I said, Nick, if Iceland is big enough, and if Switzerland is big enough, and if Norway is big enough to negotiate their own trade deals on the world stage, I'm damn certain that we're big enough to negotiate our own deals on the world stage. But it was at that moment that I realised that what Nick and Mandelson and Blair and Ken Clarke and Heseltine and all of them, what they've always believed, going right back, perhaps in some cases, to the early 1960s, going back in many ways to that great pivot that was called the Suez Crisis, after which the ruling classes in this country lost confidence in us as a nation, lost confidence in us as a people, and ever since then have believed in managed decline. And I got it at that moment. And I said to Nick, Nick, what you're really saying is you don't think we're good enough. And that's the truth of it, ladies and gentlemen. They don't think we're good enough. They don't think we're good enough to make our own laws in our own parliament. They don't think we're good enough to control our own borders. They don't think we're good enough to set the rules for our businesses and our financial institutions. They don't think we're good enough. Well, let me tell you something. I think we're good enough, and I say that because I believe in Britain and I believe in the British people, and the best and the only people who should govern this country should be the British people themselves through the ballot box. Now, it was interesting when Mr Cameron went for his renegotiation speech, obviously realising that he didn't have much red meat to throw out to the punters, did rather change tack. And he started to make a new argument. It's an argument that we hadn't heard the Prime Minister make before, but he started to argue that actually the main reason for staying in the European Union is that actually we would be safer and more secure as members of this union. Now, so it seems that what the Prime Minister wants to try to do is to set the terms of this debate. He says it's safer to be part of this union, and I'm going to argue now that actually it would be far safer for us not to be part of this union. We have to be honest with ourselves and admit that we in this country, along with France and Belgium and certainly Sweden now and other European countries, we have made some terrible mistakes over the course of the last few decades. Our leaders have completely failed to understand that if you have immigration numbers that are too great for people to assimilate, and that if you ally that to state-sponsored multiculturalism, by which I mean encouraging divisions in society, actually welcoming ghettos growing up in many of our cities and towns, that actually through that process we finished up in many parts of the UK today in a bad place. Completely separate, segregated societies. Societies in which there are practices that take place that are completely illegal under United Kingdom law, and yet our law enforcement officers and indeed our politicians turn a blind eye. You see, it isn't difficult to recognise the problem. There are tens of thousands of cases of female genital mutilation that take place in this country every single year, and to date there has not been one single prosecution. 80% of marriages that now take place, Muslim marriages that now take place completely outside English civil law. And if it comes to divorce, the woman finds herself with absolutely no rights at all. These things have happened because our leaders, who don't think we're good enough to govern our own country, also have not had the strength of character and the resolve to tell groups coming into Britain who we are and how things work here. They seem to be ashamed of the fact that we have a Judeo-Christian culture in this country. And we should actually be saying to some of these disaffected groups, there's a lot about this country that's great. Liberty, freedom, democracy, the presumption of innocence before guilt, our rights to trial by jury. There are so many things that we should be enormously proud of as a country, and yet our leaders appear to be ashamed of. So we do have a problem in this country, and we need to be honest and recognise it. But when you've got a problem, the very last thing you want to do is to add to that problem. And what we have seen happening in the European Union over the course of the last 6 to 7 months has been really pretty extraordinary, and I would suggest really quite dangerous. And I am now going to get my technical expert, who's on thin ice, isn't he, to show you a little film. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is this. The definitions for who qualifies for asylum are so wide, they include not just people coming from war, not just people coming from failed states. Mr. Juncker this morning seemed to suggest that perhaps it would even include people who were fleeing poverty. I'm sorry. We simply can't accept countless millions. There is a real and genuine threat. When ISIS say they want to flood our continent with 500,000 Islamic extremists, they mean it. Indeed, I fear we face a direct threat to our civilization if we allow large numbers of people from that war-torn region into Europe. I promise my party will stand up to this impending disaster for all concerned. A month ago, I warned Mr. Timmermans that this common EU asylum policy had absolutely no security checks whatsoever, and that there was a real, genuine threat of ISIS using this policy to infiltrate our countries and to pose great dangers to our society. People said I had no evidence for it. Well, now even the Libyan intelligence agencies are saying that ISIS not only are making money from trafficking people, but they are beginning to directly send us their terrorists. We have to have another think. We must not allow our compassion to imperil our security. Now, it's pretty obvious to me that when ISIS say they're going to flood the continent with 500,000 of their jihadist fighters, we probably ought to believe them. And even if they're exaggerating, let's say it's only 50,000. Let's say it's only 5,000. Let's say it's only 500. It only took 8 bad people last Friday night to cause that catastrophe in Paris. We have to protect ourselves against this threat. And yet it isn't happening. It isn't happening. And now we know. Now we know the truth about what happened from the ringleader, Mr. Aboud, who came back from fighting in Syria, and he came in through a Greek island and on to Paris to mastermind what happened. I heard some EU officials yesterday saying with relief, well, at least he was an EU citizen. But actually, that makes it worse, because that means it's only by luck that he didn't come to London and try and do the same sort of thing here. We have to protect ourselves in this country, and if we don't have control of our borders, we cannot protect our liberties and our freedom and our children. And I would put it to you that Mr. Cameron is absolutely wrong on this question. We would be far safer, far more secure by leaving the European Union and taking back control of our borders. But I fear that absolutely no lessons have been learnt whatsoever. And indeed, I've heard Mr. Juncker this week, and I've heard Monsieur Hollande this week say that the current policy, which effectively is that almost anybody that sets foot on European soil is allowed to stay, that current policy will continue. And it's a policy, of course, that was added to massively by Mrs. Merkel, who I think made one of the worst policy decisions that we've seen in modern times in Europe by encouraging something that was close to a stampede. That does not mean that we are blind to the suffering and the difficulties of those that have been displaced by war. And I certainly would be happy for a substantial chunk of our foreign aid budget to go and help those people who are in real need. But just to have an open door, as Europe's got, to virtually anybody without the ability to do security checks, given the great threats we face in the world, we can comfort ourselves. Oh, well, they can't all come straight here. But if within 2 or 3 years in Germany they've been given German passports, then they can, of course, all come here. So we need to protect ourselves. And to say no lessons have been learnt, well, folks, I think it's about to get a whole lot worse. One of the surprises that came at a recent European summit, and it's interesting, isn't it? People say it's safer to be in the EU, but actually, you never know what's going to be cooked up at next weekend's summit. And completely out of the blue, Mrs. Merkel, who is the real boss in Europe, of course, Mrs. Merkel announced that we now have a new policy. We are not only going to give money to Turkey to try and stop the migrant flow from that country, but we are going to introduce from July next year visa-free access from Turkey to the Schengen area. But more than that, we are now going to fast-track Turkey as full members of the European Union. Now, this is a policy that David Cameron has supported 100% ever since he became leader of the Conservative Party in 2005. It's a policy that Labour think is a very good idea, and the Lib Dems, well, I'm sure they support almost anything that's got the EU in front of it. So, if you vote to remain in this European Union, you are voting for this country to go into a full political union with Turkey. And just think about what that means. It's a country of 75 million with a rapidly expanding population. It is a country whose per capita income is even lower and even poorer than the last countries that joined, like Romania or Bulgaria or Croatia. So it would be reasonable, would it not, to say that if Turkey joins the European Union, a very large number of Turks will seek to come to Britain. But that's the best of it. The worst of it, and I certainly wouldn't want to judge Turkey by the behaviour of its football fans the other night, because once or twice in the past, I'm not so sure the English or Scottish teams have covered themselves, their fans, in glory. But what is really shocking is this, that 8% of that 75 million support ISIS. And yet we are going to go with our Prime Minister as one of the main cheerleaders at Mrs. Merkel's behest into a full political union with Turkey. Is that safer, Mr. Cameron? Is that more secure, Mr. Cameron? And add to that, that if we go into a political union with Turkey, we will find our borders will be directly with Iraq and with Syria. That is what you will get if you vote to stay in this European Union. And I do not believe that makes sense, and I don't believe the British people want this. Indeed, the other week, I did a phone-in show with LBC. They gave me 3 hours in charge of I couldn't believe it, really. Particularly given there are things like Ofcom out there. But it was the day of the Turkish elections, when the increasingly Islamist government had received an even bigger majority. And I couldn't get a single caller in the space of the hour to ring in, to disagree with me, to say that Turkey would be a member of the European Union. We, the peasants, aren't given the opportunity, normally, to express our views on such things. But via this referendum, we have got the opportunity to express our views, and we will be safer and more secure by saying no. And any arguments about economic security, which no doubt Mr. Cameron and others will try to use, they'll say that if we're not part of this union, our trade with Europe will be risked. Well, any of you that walked here this evening will probably have seen a very large number of shiny new German motor cars on our roads. Yes, we manufacture cars in Britain and we sell them to Europe, but we actually sell more cars now to the rest of the world. But they sell us nearly 1 million cars a year more than we sell them. They sell us nearly £50 billion worth a year more of goods and services than we sell. And this old tired argument that if we weren't part of the EU, all trade would cease and 3 million jobs would be at risk. Well, if that was true, there'd be 6 million jobs at risk in France and Germany. There is no threat to our economic security by not being members of this union. There is a massive potential benefit for us to control our own borders, given the threats that the world faces today. And what we're really talking about here, we're talking about taking back control of our lives. Because that's what, if you think about it, you know, back in 40 years ago, there was a referendum on a common market. Many of you in this, it's always good to have a heckler. Do come back for more. But actually, what you were sold was a false promise. You were told it was about trade, but bit by bit, Conservative administrations, Labour administrations have given away our ability to govern our own country. I want us to take back control of our fishing industry. I want us to take back control of our farming industry. I want us to take back control I want us to take back control management of our financial institutions. I want us to take back control of our energy policy so we can give our manufacturers cheaper energy. I want us to take back control of our lives. I want us to take back control of our country, because what they have done to us is they've given away our country. And I want my country back. And I would suggest we want our country back. We want our country back, and we will get it in this referendum. Thank you very much. Thank you.